Hello everyone, you are watching the second part in the fourth video of a Bible study video series. Before we get into the second part of this section of Genesis, I want to say two things. While I won't be praying in the beginning of these videos anymore, I still want to encourage you, if you intend to study the Bible seriously, to pray on your own before reading God's Word. Asking God for wisdom and the ability to understand what the Bible is saying will help you. The second thing I wanted to say was that unless you're watching this video right after the last one, which was part 1, I suggest you quickly read over the verses I went through in the last video, so it'll be fresh in your mind. In part 1 I covered Genesis chapter 4 verses 1 through 15. Beginning in verse 16 it says, "And Cain went out from the presence of Jehovah, and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch. And he builded a city, and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. And unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat Methushael, and Methushael begat Lamech." The word translated as Nod in verse 16 literally means exile. So he lived in the land of exile, which is to the east of Eden. This reference to Eden further suggests to me that it was the name of a region or country, and a city. Strong also seems to think Eden was the name of a region. Because it mentions Cain having a wife in verse 17, he must have already had a wife when these things occurred. He said himself that everyone would want to kill him, and where would he find a wife away from civilization? Speaking of his wife, I want to reaffirm that Adam and Eve were the first humans. If you don't agree, watch the second video in this series, and maybe the third video too. If they were the first humans, then where did Cain's wife come from? Well, there's a reason Adam named his wife Eve in the last chapter. Genesis chapter 3. Cain's wife must have been his sister. Now this sort of thing is wrong. See Leviticus chapter 18 verse 9 and Leviticus chapter 20 verse 17. But in the beginning this must have been God's plan for how the immediate descendants of Adam and Eve would populate the earth. I want to go a little further and point something out here, but it involves some math. Skipping ahead in Genesis chapter 5, verses 3 through 5, it says that Adam lived 930 years, and that he had Seth when he was 130 years old. Seth was the third male Adam and Eve had. If they continue to have boys at the same rate for the rest of Adam's life, assuming Eve didn't die first, Adam would have had 21 boys. That's not counting any girls Adam and Eve may have had. You may be thinking, 3 boys in 130 years? They must not have had children very quickly back then. Maybe they had children more frequently than that, normally, but they were mourning Abel's death for a long time. And so the intimacy was gone, and Eve was less likely to conceive. Another thing to consider is that Genesis is only mentioning the males. Adam and Eve probably had a decent-sized family before Cain killed Abel. My guess is around 3 to 5 children total, 2 of those being boys, of course, because there was Cain and Abel. The children were probably pretty far apart from each other in age. Even if Adam and Eve were 70 years old when they had their 5th child, which is assuming they had 5 children by the time they lost Abel, and that there were 60 years between their 5th child and their 3rd boy, that would still leave room for 14 years between each child on average. Basically, all I'm saying is that the relationship between Cain and his sister wife may have been more like the relationship between cousins than siblings, because one of them was probably a lot older than the other by today's standards. As far as the number of children Adam and Eve had, William Whiston, in a footnote in his translation of Josephus, The Complete Works, said, "The number of Adam's children as says the old tradition, was 33 sons and 23 daughters. I have a theory about Adam and Eve relating to their children marrying each other. It's probably not original, but I came up with it on my own. You can read about it in an article called something like Adam and Eve's Children Are Early Roots. You should be able to find this article on my website by going to the topical guide page. Strong says that the name Irad, which is in verse 18, means fugitive in Hebrew. Continuing on into verse 19, it says, And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal, and he was the father of such as dwell in tents and have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and pipe. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal Cain, the forger of every cutting instrument of brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah. Just so you know that the names of these genealogies had meaning and weren't assigned just so English speakers couldn't pronounce them, I want to give you the meaning of 2 names. Strong's Hebrew Dictionary says that the name Tubal Cain means, quote, offspring of Cain. Strong's Dictionary also says that Naamah, which may not look like a very feminine name when it's written in English, means pleasantness. And by the way, I don't claim to be pronouncing these names correctly, so I wouldn't quote me on them if I were you. Continuing on in verse 23, it says, And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man for wounding me, and a young man for bruising me. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 70 and 7-fold. To be honest, these verses are a little confusing to me, so I'm going to compare different translations to hopefully clear things up a little bit more for you. While the King James Version footnotes suggests, For I would slay a man in my wound, and a young man in my hurt. The American Standard Version footnotes suggests, For I will slay a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Maybe what Lamech is saying in verses 23 and 24 is that he would slay someone for hurting him, and that he, being better than Cain, would be avenged much more. It's still a little foggy as to what these verses mean to me, but hopefully that clears things up a little more for you. Verse 25 continues, And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For, said she, God hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain slew him. And to Seth, to him also was there born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men to call upon the name of Jehovah. Strong's Hebrew Dictionary says that Seth's name literally means put, or according to Strong, in other words, substituted. The footnotes for the American Standard Version helps clear up what Seth's name means a little bit more. It gives the Hebrew word that's translated as hath appointed in this verse, which, according to Strong, literally means, quote, to place. So, in other words, in Hebrew, there's a play on words in this verse between Seth, which means put, and the word that's translated as hath appointed, which means to place. The name Enosh was a word that could be used generally for man. Sometime after Enosh was born, there must have been more than just a few people on the earth. Otherwise, Moses probably wouldn't have said, men began, in this verse. Between Cain, Seth, and Adam, the human race was starting to expand, although maybe not very fast at this point.